On behalf of the Charlotte Debutante Club, it is my pleasure to present to you this evening the 2012 debutantes. Miss Catherine McKay Belk, presented by her father. Catherine is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Milburn Belk Jr., granddaughter of Debutante Club member Mrs. James Fielder Cook, and great-granddaughter of Debutante Club member the late Mrs. Hamilton Witherspoon McKay. Her marshals are Mr. Thomas Milburn Belk III and Mr. Anthony Alexander Dillon. Miss Caroline Leonora Davis, presented by her father. Caroline is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Tate Davis, Sr. Her marshals are Mr. Thomas Tate Davis, Jr. and Mr. Victor Carlton Showalter. Miss Elizabeth Hilton Dickens, presented by her father. Bess is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alvin Johnston Dickens III, granddaughter of Debutante Club member Mrs. William Anthony White Jr., and great-granddaughter of Debutante Club member, the late Mrs. Samuel Wilson Smith. Her marshals are Mr. Alvin Johnston Dickens IV, Mr. Peter Alexander Kelpin. Miss Catherine Millis Ellerby, presented by her father. Catherine is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. David Mason Ellerby. Her marshals are Mr. Thomas Fitzharris Ellerby, Mr. Seth Leldon Knight IV. Miss Anna Scott Faree, presented by her father. Scotty is the daughter of Dr. and Mrs. Charles Elliott Faree. Her marshals are Mr. Charles Elliott Faree Jr. and Mr. Robert Marshall Sykes. Miss Julia Parker Fuller, presented by her father. Julia Parker is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Walker Fuller III and granddaughter of debutante club member Mrs. Franklin Jackson Blythe Jr. Her marshals are Mr. Robert Walker Fuller IV and Mr. Tyler Jordan Munson. Miss Anita Hampton Griffin, presented by her father. Anita is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. William Scott Griffin. Her marshals are Mr. Rhett William Postal and Mr. Carter Stevenson Barnhart. Miss Laura Wellman Hain, presented by her father. Laura is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. John Travis Hain. Her marshals are Mr. John Arthur Hayne and Mr. Hal Knight Hallett III. Miss Caroline Virginia Hallett, presented by her father. Caroline is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Lardner Hallett, granddaughter of debutante club member Mrs. John Lindsay Hallett, and great-granddaughter of debutante club members the late Mrs. Hal Knight Hallett and the late Mrs. James Wilson Gibbon. Her marshals are Mr. Benjamin Waring Hallett and Mr. Alexander Worth McAllister, Jr. Miss Madison Fleming Lee, presented by her father. Madison is the daughter of Miss Lynn Dyer Lee and Mr. and Mrs. William States Lee IV, granddaughter of debutante club member Mrs. William States Lee III, great-granddaughter of debutante club member the late Mrs. Walter Dallin Toy Jr., and great-great-granddaughter of debutante club member the late Mrs. William States Lee. Her marshals are Mr. William States Lee V and Mr. Matthew Gray Cornegay. Miss Emma Carol Lewis, presented by her father. Emma Carroll is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Carlton Blake Lewis and granddaughter of debutante club member Mrs. John Lawrence Dabbs III. Her marshals are Mr. John Carlton Lewis and Mr. Thomas Brody Winburn III. Miss Eleanor Fleming Mark, presented by her father. Nellie is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph John Kaler Mark, Jr. Her marshals are Mr. Joseph John Kaler Mark III and Mr. John Joseph O'Brien, Jr. Miss Elizabeth Stinson McCann, presented by her father. Elizabeth is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. William Stevens McCann, granddaughter of debutante club member Mrs. John Lawrence McCann Jr. and debutante club member the late Mrs. Nona Stokes Swearingen, and great-granddaughter of debutante club member the late Mrs. Joseph Vestal Moffett Jr. and debutante club member the late Mrs. Robert Wilson Stokes Jr. Her marshals are Mr. William Alexander Kennedy and Mr. Thomas Winfield Manley. Miss Ann Stewart Elliott Mitchner, presented by her father. Ann Stewart is the daughter of Mrs. Roland Elliott Mitchner and Mr. and Mrs. Victor Carton Mitchner, and granddaughter of debutante club member Mrs. Stewart Whitfield Elliott. Her marshals are Mr. Jacob Rhett Snipes and Mr. Thomas Stephen Bremer. Miss Arlie Mason Pierce, presented by her stepfather. Arlie is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. David Reginald Tate and the late Mr. Roger Grigg Pierce. Her marshals are Mr. John Winston Ash and Mr. Clark Inman Palmer. Miss Elizabeth Bryan Pitts, presented by her father. Betsy Bryan is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Rodney Creamer Pitts and granddaughter of debutante club member, the late Mrs. William Reed Pitts. Her marshals are Mr. Rodney Carson Pitts and Mr. Michael Edward Mandel. Miss Sarah Bacote Tanner, presented by her father. Sally is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Kenneth Spencer Tanner III and great-granddaughter of debutante club member, the late Mrs. James Wilson Gibbon. Her marshals are Mr. James Harrison Mathis and Mr. Samuel Ramsey Ackerman. Miss Patricia Ann Teeter, presented by her father. Tricia is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Christopher Teeter. Her marshals are Mr. James Alexander Hale and Mr. Quinn John Rogan. Miss Mary Helen Tomlinson, presented by her father. Mary Helen is the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. John Buchanan Tomlinson and granddaughter of debutante club member, Mrs. Carol Finley Tomlinson. Her marshals are Mr. Thomas Carroll Tomlinson and Mr. Justin Robert Davis. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2012 debutantes.